Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you my 10-1 tier list for rating after all of the Aberris raid testing is wrapped up, after the 25% health gain and 25% increase to damage dealt by enemies. I am ready to talk about my thoughts for the top healers going into the next raid. I will give a bit of a caveat that we have not tested the last boss yet, and I'm going to give my theories on what that fight could involve. But, of course, we're going to have to see, as it did heavily impact the meta when we went into Vault of the Incarnates. Also, keep in mind, Vault of the Incarnates had some crazy whack healer imbalance that we're going to talk about in this video, and I don't really see it going into the Aberris raid. I think, by and large, every single healer can compete in incredibly high-end content. I'm talking about, like, Hall of Fame, probably, like, top 50 and above and everything. All of these healers can have a place if you're just skilled at playing them. The template that we're going to use for the tier list and everything like that is going to be S tier, being the healers that I think you could bring 2 of into hardcore rating, high-end rating, all that fun stuff. A tier is going to be things that you absolutely are bringing 1 of. B tier could be like a 5th healer, maybe, depending on what's going on, okay? First and foremost, starting off our list, I think this one's going to be quite easy, is Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman looks fantastic going into the new raid. For quite a while, they were just gapping people, doing like way more healing and a massive amount of passive damage, thanks to things like Acid Rain. They did rein in their output. They had like a 5.5% nerf that we had, but even despite that, they're still performing extremely well in testing, doing just fantastic output, and I think that this incoming raid in Aberris is wonderful for Spirit Link Totem. A lot of the fights that we had in Vault of the Incarnates, namely things like Dathia or even Razageth as well, had a number of areas where you could just kind of hit like half of the raid, maybe. Broodkeeper, another good example where you just hit like half of the raid, maybe, with your Spirit Link Totem. But Aberris, there's so many areas where everybody can be stacked, or just almost everybody. One of the hardest fights coming into it is the Skarn, which is a smaller room that is pushing people away, and you have to make sure you're getting pushed in extremely specific areas to avoid traps, and to avoid other players who are going to get these sort of like fire lines getting shot out at them. And if you take a second tick of that line, you are just instantly dead. And so if you take a tick, even though you're not debuffed, you could get targeted later and just instantly perish, and that's lights out for you. Which means most of the raid is going to be stacked during this period of time, and the other people are also going to be kind of in a line towards each other. So Shaman's going to be able to do a great job with the chain heal heavy build that they've been playing with, to be able to spot heal as needed, provide massive cooldowns for the raid, and be able to have excellent mobile healing when they need to, out of like Spirit Walker's Grace. They've got Gust of Wind in case Sarkareth is going to have tremendous knockbacks, which from Phase 2 onwards they will. Sarkareth is going to have a mechanic which is basically like the remnant of Ner'zhul, I believe it's called Malevolence, which would knock back players when the healers dispel. The difference being is that back in the day with Remnant, you could mass dispel, and you could only get the effect of basically like 1 knockback. So you wouldn't get like knocked off the platform, you get knocked from one edge of the platform to the next. I wonder if we get into a situation where the strategy is to double knockback, but Blizzard would have fixed the mechanic so you would get the effect of 2 knockbacks, and you'd need things like Gust of Wind, or if you really needed to, Shaman could go Goblin as well to stay on. So they already have good resources there at their disposal. I think they're tremendously well suited for the raid, and that's why I think it's possible that you could bring 2 of them, but you certainly are locking 1 down. Next up on our list, we've got Preservation Evoker, and again, to clarify, I believe that Resto Shaman or Preservation Evoker could be stacked and could have 2 of those healers be brought to the table. I don't think you're running 2 and 2. Just for reference, but Preservation Evoker, while it dominated in Vault of the Incarnates, doing 25-30% more healing on average, more than everybody else at the very beginning of the expansion, it has been reined in significantly going into the next tier, where for a while it looked to be about average through a lot of our raid tests. Once the 25% stamina and enemy damage increases went into the game, we only got to have 1 raid test to be able to see the performance of Preservation Evoker and all the other healers. But what we saw was that since it's the spec that gains the most, since it is benefiting absolutely from Rewind and Emerald Communion, and it's questioned as to whether or not it would be enough to run things like Golden Hour, Lifeline, Temporal Anomaly type combinations, since they've been so significantly nerfed since 10.0. I do still believe that Preservation has enough value to offer, especially from its output, but also brings some decent utility for the knockback effects and the sort of bursts of movement that are required for the Aberrus raid. Things like Skarn have some very quick knockback effects where you need to make sure the entire raid is in a very concentrated position, standing away from the players who are going to be marked by debuffs and having fire lines getting shot at them. And something like Time Spiral can be some decent utility to bring to the table as a result of that. We also had mentioned that Sarkareth is going to have some knockbacks, much the same way that Remnant of Ner'zhul would have. And if they're of such a high strength that you would need certain abilities to stay on the platform, it was insanely useful back with Remnant of Ner'zhul, just like it was with Kil'jaeden, but by the way, which Kil'jaeden as a mythic end boss also required you to have something to stay on the platform, and it looks very similar as a platform to Sarkareth's platform, and has a very similar mechanic to Sarkareth. It lends to reason that there's a pretty good chance that Preservation Evoker is going to have some value on that fight. We'll have to see. I think Preservation Evoker's output's going to be very high, and I would be shocked, I tell you, if they weren't designing fights with Preservation Evoker in mind, based off what we just saw out of Raszageth. For our A tier, again, to emphasize, the A tier is the hard lock specs that I think are absolutely getting brought to all of the encounters, and shock and awe, Disc Priest is back. While it absolutely carried certain fights or certain phases of fights, most notably the Inversion phase or the Storm Shield phase of Raszageth, where it was insanely dominant, Disc Priest kind of struggled after the World First progression. And in a large part, it was just due to the crazy button bloat and just kind of mediocre output that it had for the average player. But after receiving a lot more buttons and a bit of power along the way, I do think Disc Priest is back for the Aberrus raid. Not only is Barrier tremendous, and this is again what we were talking about with Shaman, there's a lot of areas that you're able to stack up. But there's also a lot of areas where you're able to benefit massively from your party doing a good job of playing around large cooldowns like Barrier or like a Disc's Ramp. We go back to Rashok because that is kind of like the Sludge Fist. It's like the big healer check fight that I anticipate really challenging a lot of raid groups. It not only is going to have heal absorb effects, which are very predictable, which is insanely good for a disc ramp, but they also have the follow-up damage of players needing to remove their debuffs by dealing damage to the raid. This is extremely similar to what we saw out of Council of Blood from Castle Nathria, where players had to jump to remove their stacks. Now in this situation, just like in Council of Blood, having a barrier down and then aggressively popping those debuffs and removing them quickly actually made things a lot safer. When you're able to play around a disc ramp and able to play around heavy burst output, whether it's rewind or a disc ramp, it makes the fight a lot safer in general because it's just like tearing a band-aid off, but having the strength of some output to be able to soothe your wounds along the way. So I do think Disc has wonderful output along the way. The absorbs they're providing are going to be extremely light coming into the next tier, and thankfully, there's only like bursts of movement. There's not this sort of like Dathia or even like Broodkeeper where you're sort of running all over the place all the time. Even the intermission phases of like Raszageth were particularly debilitating for Disc in a lot of areas. Having to get picked up by Evokers to be able to get through Tempest Wing type mechanics was exhausting to say the least. We don't know how Sarkareth is going to look, but we do know raid group's going to want that stamina buff, and we do know that there's dispelled mechanics going into the Dread mechanic for Sarkareth. Like I mentioned before, with Remnant of Ner'zhul, you had 2 debuffs going out at the same time that you just mass dispelled, and it made it so there was only 1 knockback effect. I think it stands to reason you could consider having a mass dispel not have the singular knockback effect, and instead it hits a double knockback, and you need the mass dispel to have an easier time to rip that band-aid off, and then have to rely on things like Goblin Jump, Evoker Rescue to keep that priest on the platform. Either way, Disc is back, baby, for the Aberrus raid. Holy Paladin should come as no surprise, as they have been the topic of just a lot of change. And I don't think enough people have been making content or videos talking about all of the change. But Holy Paladin, in addition to bringing Devotion Aura, which is always pretty much a hard lock for the spec, they were really quiet through a lot of Vaults of the Incarnates. And I think that they've been a pretty major beneficiary of like the 1005, 1007 sort of rebalancing to get healing back under control. And so I do expect Holy Paladin to be in a much better position. There's also also a number of knockback type effects going out throughout this raid, and like I mentioned before, it's sort of like bursts of movement, where you don't need to be moving and running all over the place all the time like we saw at Vault of the Incarnates, but instead, you need to quickly get into one position, or if you have certain immunities that you can avoid some of these knockback effects, wonderful. There's also a decent amount of priority target going on throughout this raid, and I'd be curious to look at how Holy Paladin's going to respond to some of the fights like I mentioned before, with Ziskarn, but also with things like Echo of Neltharion, which has the bosses pulsing a lot of AoE damage, forcing you to rapidly be healing through ever-rising bursts of incoming damage, which are happening at around 4 or 5 seconds apart from each other, which should be just enough time for Devotion Aura to be able to fit in damage reduction for the entire raid for just a couple ticks to help you get over that next hump. So I do expect Holy Paladin to have some tremendous value there, and a fight like Echo of Neltharion is also keeping the raid incredibly close together, which should be great for Holy Paladins as well. Hard lock Holy Paladin, and I think that we're going to be seeing them pump way more output than we saw from them in Vault of the Incarnates. On the B tier, these are healers that I think could fit in as a 5th healer, and I think that they are all able to be represented in Hall of Fame rating, high-end rating, and possibly even the Race to World First. Starting it off is Holy Priest, and while these were greatly favored by Liquid in particular in Vault of the Incarnates, Holy Priest just kind of continues to get stronger. Holy Priest bringing, of course, Symbol of Hope, which is a bit of that niche utility, resetting the cooldown of your allies' defensives, is actually just insanely good as players get better and better at learning it, and especially when DPS classes like, let's say, Boomkins are getting a full reset and they're getting full value of their defensive with an extra use by virtue of things like Symbol of Hope. Unfortunately, when you have a lot of hunters or something like that, yeah, the ability is kind of mediocre. But I do think that Symbol, the extra mana regen, and the new tier set bonus giving Holy Priest a tremendous amount of additional apotheosis uptime, feeds into more holy words, and continues to reduce the cooldown of Salvation, which again makes it a more reliable and more consistent cooldown to be used around every 3.5 minutes or so through my testing. I do think Holy Priest is going to absolutely slam healing going into the next raid with more powerful holy words than ever and more healing just automatically happening by virtue of Prayer of Mending. The extra damage contribution is going to be kind of middling, but having another PI in the raid never hurts to be able to offer. And so Holy Priest as that 4th or 5th healer in like Hall of Fame rating could absolutely be a strong selection. Next up on our list, we've got Resto Druid, and despite just absolutely shredding in healing at the beginning of Vault of the Incarnates, we never really saw the spec represented very heavily in high-end rating. Part of the reason was that Evoker was sort of stealing the limelight, especially with how insane the Rescue and Dreamflight and just general burst output was for Preservation Evoker on Razageth in particular, but also, besides the overwhelming amount of healing, Resto Druid was just kind of missing something else to be able to bring to the table in a raiding environment. We saw out of Holy Priest, for example, how valuable Symbol of Hope can be in really well-organized groups who know to be able to play off of it, but Resto, I feel like, has been missing something kind of ever since they moved Moving Trank. And I think going into this next raid, it kind of continues with that trend. There's nothing that has really just screamed, take Resto Druid on encounters like Echo of Neltharion, on Magmarax, or on Rashok, where other healers aren't able to sort of fill in the gaps. In fact, a lot of times when players are so heavily stacked, it's benefiting and it's allowing damage reduction cooldowns like Spirit Link or like Barrier to really heavily shine. And this is, again, sort of like a highlight of where certain healers just have and certain healers just have not. And for that, I think Resto Druid is one of those healers you could bring as like the 5th healer going into the Aberrus raid, but not necessarily as a hard lock on every single encounter. And lastly, I hate to do it to him, but we've got Mistweaver. Once again, I think this is another one of the healers, just like Resto Druid, that brings a lot of output. And in fact, it actually has a very interesting way that it can sort of augment its output, whether you're running longer duration of Celestial or a shorter duration, to be able to provide more output when your group is going to need it, making you very flexible, which is good utility to be able to bring to your group. But besides just an overwhelming amount of healing, there's not really a lot getting brought to the table on this one. Mistweaver has had a literal cornucopia of buffs getting added into it from 10.05 to 10.07 and even into 10.1. The amount of mana that you are receiving from your set bonus is absolutely absurd, but at the end of the day, there's going to be something a little more heavily needed for the raid. Some people have questioned as to whether or not Brewmaster or, say, Windwalker would not be brought to the table. And then Mistweaver would be the one to be able to bring the debuff for the physical damage. That's entirely possible, and that is something that I'm not really counting on when making this tier list. I'm not really counting on other classes or other specs in the class being bad to make it justified. If that's the case, it could be brought, but I don't think that you're solely bringing like a druid or solely bringing like a priest because they bring fortitude, or solely bringing a paladin because of Devo or so the 3% Devo or a mastery. I do think Mistweaver has a lot of cool things going for it, but I think this is once again a case of the have and have-nots for this incoming raid, where Mistweaver is going to do tremendously well on being able to stick to the boss like glue, whether it has all of the movement it needs with Transcend and with Roll or Chi Wave, depending on what they want to be able to take advantage of. But besides that, I don't think that they're bringing the utility that's going to be needed for the raid when there is the ballooned up health, the ballooned up damage. You're really going to see the benefit of damage reduction auras and just overwhelming burst cooldowns that are relating to the damage you take, like Rewind, to be able to keep other players alive at high-end rating. Overall, I'm actually really interested in playing Mistweaver for what it's worth. I'm probably going to have Resto Shaman as an alt of mine, and of course, I'll be maining that Priest, but I do think for the Race to World first, you'd be hard-pressed to see Mistweaver get represented in that end. To that point, I think the World First comp that you're going to see on a lot of the later encounters, these are like the last 4 encounters, I think, for the raid, are going to consist of Shaman, Evoker, Disc Priest, and Paladin, with either Shaman or Evoker being the 5th healer when needed. Once again, I do think that all of the healing is much better balanced, and it might be one of the better tiers that we've had in a while for healer balance in general, but as ever, a tier list is going to be existing, and I wanted to give my thoughts on it and share what I think is coming ahead of 10.1. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the Patreon, as we already do have a couple awesome supporters. So big shout out to Kevro, Simon, Merle, and John for getting ourselves started on the Patreon. Linked in the description down below. If you enjoy the tier list, be sure to leave it with a thumbs up and subscribe for more. And we'll be back with the M+ tier list very soon.